The air crackles with panic, hands flail, papers fly, and screams bounce off the walls. It's pure chaos. Men in bowler hats and bow ties, drenched in sweat, scream into the void. No one's buying. The wolves of Wall Street prowl like caged animals, muttering, praying, but the nightmare won't end. Outside, thousands crush against barricades. A woman, eyes desperate, clutches her bank book, pleading with a cop. Her life savings vanish in stocks she can't touch. Cameras flash on hollow faces. Cigarettes trembling in their hands. Whispers spread. Someone's leapt off the roof. Across New York, radios stutter. The news to a nation blind to the cliff they've just tumbled off. One who thought prosperity was forever. That evening, the sun sets on a city that's lost $14 billion in a single day, and the glittering promise of the Roaring Twenties lies in pieces. But the crash was only the beginning. How was it that a golden decade ignited the worst financial disaster in history? And more importantly, could it happen again? Let's rewind for a moment. The world was a very different place back then. It was the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties as folks like to call it, and the United States was riding high after the First World War. The war had ended in 1918, and while Europe was left to pick up the pieces, its cities scarred and economies limping, America emerged as a powerhouse. Factories that had churned out tanks and rifles switched gears to produce cars, radios and washing machines. People couldn't get enough of these shiny new things. Imagine a farmer's wife in Kansas marvelling at an electric stove, or a kid in Chicago tuning into a jazz broadcast for the first time. Life felt modern, fast and unstoppable. Money flowed like champagne at a speakeasy. The stock market became everyone's favourite new game, a dazzling casino where even barbers and taxi drivers swapped tips on the next big stock. Wall Street was a golden beacon, and people poured their savings, and sometimes even borrowed cash, into shares, convinced the prices would only climb higher. By 1929, the market was a balloon stretched tight, inflated by wild optimism and shaky loans. People didn't just invest, they speculated, betting on a future that sparkled with wealth. Cities buzzed with life, skyscrapers pierced the clouds in New York, and women danced the Charleston in hidden bars. It was a time of excess, a party where the band played louder to drown out any whispers of doubt. But beneath the glamour, cracks were forming. Farmers weren't sharing the party. Out in the plains, they'd overworked the land during the war to feed the world, and now prices for wheat and corn plummeted. Debt piled up, and foreclosures crept across the countryside like a slow shadow. In the cities, workers churned out goods faster than ever, but wages didn't keep pace. Families bought radios and cars on credit, stacking IOUs that they couldn't always pay. The wealth wasn't trickling down, it was pooling at the top, where the richest 1% owned more than a third of everything. Across the Atlantic, things were shakier still. Germany and Austria staggered under war reparations, their economies propped up by American loans. Britain and France leaned on the US too, borrowing to rebuild. It was a fragile web. America's prosperity held it all together, but if that thread snapped, the whole thing could unravel. By 1929, the party was getting sloppy. The stock market hit dizzying heights, but smart money started to slip out. Factories slowed as unsold goods stacked up. Then, in October, the music stopped. Black Tuesday, they'd call it. October 29th, 1929. When the market crashed like a chandelier smashing to the floor. Billions vanished in hours, and panic spread faster than a prairie fire. Banks called in loans, but people had nothing left to give. The balloon didn't just pop, it exploded. The air still hummed with the echo of Black Tuesday, as if the world had grasped and forgotten to breathe again. The stock market's glittering casino had collapsed, a house of cards kicked over by its own weight, and the pieces fell hard. Billions of dollars gone in a day, like smoke curling up from a snuffed-out candle. Folks who'd been millionaires at breakfast stood hollow-eyed by supper, staring at ticker tapes that mocked them with ruin. The balloon of the Roaring Twenties had burst, and the Great Depression crept in, a shadow stretching long and cold across the land. Wall Street's crash wasn't just numbers on a board, it was a hammer smashing lives apart. Banks were wobbling. They'd lent money hand over fist during the boom, and now with stocks worthless and borrowers broke, they called in debts like desperate landlords. But the pockets they reached into were empty. People rushed to withdraw their savings, clutching at the last threads of security, only to find bank doors locked and closed signs staring back at them. By 1933, thousands of banks had crumbled, over 9,000 in all, swallowing life savings with them. Imagine a factory worker in Detroit, his paychecks gone, standing in a line that stretched around the block, hoping for a miracle that never came. Factories that once roared with life went quiet. Companies couldn't sell their mountain of goods, and so they stopped making them. Workers got pink slips instead of pay, and unemployment clawed its way back up. Shanty towns sprang up, ragged clusters of tin and cardboard dubbed Hoovervilles, a bitter jab at President Herbert Hoover, who people blamed for letting things get so bad. Out in the countryside it was no better. Farmers, already bruised from the 20s, faced a double blow. Prices for crops sank even lower. Corn at 10 cents a bushel was barely worth hauling, and then the land itself turned on them. The Dust Bowl hit the early 30s, a plague of storms born from overworked soil and drought. Wind scooped up the plains and hurled black clouds of dirt across the sky. Day turned to night, dust crept through cracks, coating lungs and hope alike. Across the ocean the ripples spread. Europe, tethered to American loans, felt the pinch as US banks pulled back. Germany's fragile recovery shattered. Unemployment soared, and whispers of anger grew louder, sowing the seeds for darker days. The Great Depression gripped the world tightly, like a shadow that wouldn't lift, until the early 30s brought a glimmer of hope. Franklin Roosevelt took the reins in 1933, and with a new ringmaster came a plan aptly called the New Deal. No more waiting for the balloon to reinflate on its own. He cranked up the government engines and jobs sprang up fast. Men built dams, roads and parks. The banks were put on a leash, and savings were given a safety net. Farmers got a boost. The dust was still swirling, but prices were inching up. With relief poured out, soup lines shortened, and hope began to creep back. It wasn't instant, but the 30s limped along. Scars ran deep, but by 1939 the wheels turned more smoothly, just in time for World War II, where factories sprung into action, once again churning out tanks and planes. And by 1945 the shadow had faded. The Depression was a memory, pried loose by determination, policy and the hard shove of a world war. But the question still remains, could it happen again? It's not impossible. Markets are still dancing on thin air with stocks ballooning and debt towering like brittle twigs. If banks slip their leash again and greed outpaces sense, then something could catch. We saw tremors in 2008, echoes of the old tune with homes lost and jobs gone, although fortunately not as deep. And still, the ground's firmer now. Roosevelt's legacy, along with banking rules, helped weather the storms. Governments move more quickly, tossing lifelines when the earth starts to quake. And yet a new shadow looms. Digital trades flash in seconds, and global threads are more connected than ever. One big snag, let's say a cyber crash or a debt bomb, and the whole house of cards could come tumbling down. It's not likely to happen tomorrow, but never say never. The 20s gave us a warning. When the party roars too fierce, the silence waits close behind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ciao for now.